second edition of the Veracious Show podcast. My name is Lorne Risley. I'm going to be your host for this episode as always. On this edition, I thought I'd touch on, as many of these podcasts often start with a story. Not too long ago, I should say, or recently, as is probably the easier way of saying it. See, trying to be clever, always the case. Anyway, back to the point. Recently, I was on Twitter, cycling through. Previous couple of days prior, tweeted out some bits and bobs about a news story that ran that I saw with regards to the England football team. The World Cup is going on as we speak at the moment, and the football pundits, the national press, the sporting press and sporting media had reported on a story whereby the team sheet for England, who are up against Panama tomorrow at the date of this recording, they'd zoomed in, they'd seen it, they'd managed to get a snapshot of it clear enough to be able to see what the formation would be and what the players would be in terms of the training regimen, in terms of the system they were practicing. This was then reported, disseminated to the public. I took a stance on this because I feel like the point of this podcast is going to be the media's relationship to the public, their responsibility, and where I feel they are going wrong. And I'll make the point now because otherwise I'll probably lose the thread at some stage. For me, a valid excuse to undermine the pretense that they put forward when covering the news stories in the way they do, which is usually, if I don't report this story, somebody else will. Okay, let's break that down, shall we? The idea that you have to succumb to the lowest common denominator because otherwise you will be less successful than someone else is worth breaking down for two reasons. Number one, the public do need to hold themselves to a higher account. What do I mean by that? Well, they see a story like that, maybe don't read it. I'll be perfectly honest, 100% honest. I saw the story, I read the circumstances under which it came out, but I didn't look at the team sheet and I haven't seen the pictures. Why? Because I don't want to. It's very simple. Didn't want to know what the team sheet looks like, so I didn't look at it. However, I did want to understand, right, was this leaked by a player, by the manager themselves? Was it taken by the foreign press and then disseminated there? Etc, etc. Why is that important? Well, because even then, I feel like the press in this country could have had something in terms of a moral high ground by reporting the fact that the team sheet had leaked to the national press in Panama as a way of just saying, look, we're aware the sheet is out. However, because we are the English national press, we know we're selling papers to England fans. We don't want to seek to undermine the national team, whom we seek to profit off of by covering their story, by leaking the information. We're going to do our part to try and stem the tide here. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. Now, I've seen the argument made from the other side of the fence. In fact, the reason why it's prompted me to make this podcast is very simple. I've actually engaged with a member of the British press, Paddy something. I won't commit his name to memory because I can't be asked. And I've seen him enough times on the Saturday Supplement to understand he's not one of the stronger pundits in terms of his standpoints, in terms of the points that he makes, in terms of how eloquent he is. So it is what it is there. I posed a situation, I basically laid out my thoughts in tweets, which you can find on my Twitter account, and asked him to retort. And the best he could do was effectively, the way I read it is, it's a bar, but you're asking me to comment on how grammatically correct it is, as opposed to actually responding. And the response effectively was, you've summed up the sentiments of 12 people that I'd spoken to already. I don't really know how to take that. I was asking him a question in terms of, I want to know what your thoughts are. You're a journalist. or journos. I refuse to call them journos because I know it's a derogatory term used by football fans and journalists. But you're a journalist. Your job is to write stories. Your job is to investigate and inform the public. The problem with that, though, is that's a naive view of what that role is, because effectively these days, though, is that journalists are salesmen. They are representatives of their news outlet, attempting to generate interest in stories, which oftentimes means appealing to the lowest common denominator, which brings me back to my original point of the two-pronged offensive. Yes, the public need to hold themselves to a higher account and show a degree of restraint. If you don't want to see stories like that, don't read stories like that. If you don't want to see something, don't pay it any attention. When you see a controversial figure and you hear them saying outlandish shit, do you know the best way to take power away from those people? It's quite simple. You do not pay attention to them. Their actions are what you pay attention to, because if they do things that are then reprehensible in terms of breaking the law, in terms of setting a bad standard, then you can take action in turn. Engaging in conversation only seeks to highlight their agenda and their sentiments, which spreads through to the populace. It spreads through to the mass critical thinking, which is where we've ended up with the national press. My stance on this point is very simple. I believe the press serve the public. They are there to garner and gather information, present that information in an unbiased perspective. Yes, they're allowed to offer analysis and critique, so long as it's adequately presented as such. The problem I then have is when journalists get defensive about the dichotomy that they have an English national football team, and this is the example because it's a microcosm of journalism as a whole at the moment, and why the public perception of the press is so piss poor. It's similar to politicians. We just don't trust them anymore. And I use them as a generalization because it seems like there isn't a journalist out there that's actually coming out and defending the fans who are rightly pissed off by this situation. Anyway, coming back to the point. As far as journalists are concerned, I feel it's incumbent upon them to hold their journalistic standards to a higher account. If people are unable to understand that this situation is a microcosm, in the sense that the press stand to profit from running stories about Sterling, the issue with the gun tattoo. The guy's got a tattoo on his leg. So, what's the... I genuinely don't understand the effect it has on the wider world there at all. If he's a role model to kids, well, you're not allowed to get a tattoo until you're 16. So if that's your concern, the law prevents you there. In terms of having a gun tattooed on you, you have computer games, you have popular media, you have graffiti artists. Guns are everywhere in terms of I forget the word, iconography, or something along those lines. But it's a graphic image that's everywhere. It's not hard to see a picture of a gun. In terms of his story, though, it's dependent on public opinion when the story is presented. If they feel they stand to profit by tearing a character down, by painting them as this character, and then suddenly pulling the rug out of the situation, it's almost wrestling psychology. Build the face, build the face, build the face, build the face, and then all of a sudden turn him heel, because it snaps people's attention. Gets them to pay attention to something they wouldn't otherwise pay attention to, when it's the perception they built in the first place. And oftentimes that narrative is peddled by the same media that will then seek to either perpetuate that same narrative in the face of evidence to the contrary, or seeing dwindling sales from their magazines or dwindling interest in their traffic in their websites, will then seek to put out puff pieces, put out question pieces. Are England in decline? The one that always gets me, in football journalism specifically, is watching the Sunday supplement, and I would invite anyone to do this. Go back, even to just 2 years ago, and watch a lot of these pundits talk about specific managers while they're doing well, and the praise and the stories they tell and the history they have. Fast forward to when they get fired, or the weeks precluding that. It's like you're listening to two different people talk. because the analysis, broadly speaking, changes from one of enormous positivity, because the public opinion is behind there and there's a story to be written, to negativity, because, again, it's not necessarily the truth. It's a bent proportion of the truth. As it relates to this story, though, it's quite clear that submitting information that has an adverse effect to the topic that you cover is morally wrong. When the press start to become the story, when the press and media decide to run with news that doesn't serve the public interest and only serves their own, that's when they start crossing the line. And the defences I've seen of this are, broadly speaking, like I said, number one, well, if I hadn't run it, someone else would have. So I might as well be the one to make the money. Okay? I've heard that defence before. Where have I heard that defence? Oh, yeah. In most computer games, when you loot bodies. In fact, there's a scene in Mass Effect 2, if I'm not mistaken, where they're looting the bodies of dead people. You come across them and they say, oh, better with us than them. There's a Paragon meter at that moment saying, that's wrong, pack it in or I'm going to shoot your ass. If an EA-backed game can see the moral difference between it might as well be me to hold yourself to a higher standard, you don't need that, then I think university-educated, tenured journalists should be able to do the same thing. The second defence I see is, well, it is in the public interest, because people want to know what the team sheet is. They might, but football fans love to speculate. That's their whole gig, week to week, month to month, year to year. Football fans don't deal in definitives. They deal in superlatives. They deal with ifs, ands, maybes. So to say, oh, it serves the public interest by just no, it doesn't. It's bullshit. Absolute horseshit. The one that got me, though, was a particular response. I can't remember the name. I think her name is Natalie. She's a correspondent reporter, member of the media, Sky News, BBC News, whatever. And there was some reference to, I left my pom-poms at home. I guess as a direct reference to the fact that she was a woman, and maybe the inflection by a previous comment was that she shouldn't be reporting it because of that. I don't know the full context of it, but I would encourage people to look into that, because if the context is that football fans are attacking her for being a woman and reporting on it, then yeah, that's kind of irrelevant. It's the notion rather than the individual that's perpetuating this. It's the media as a whole that we're critiquing here. But if that was her attempting to leverage the fact that she's a woman against football fans who are seeking to make a valid point, that makes her a fucking asshole. And that's just, she's the kind of person that's undermining that Me Too movement in the sense of, oh, I see what you did there. You're trying to shut down the argument by bringing something that's got nothing to do with the point that we're trying to make here by saying, I'm a woman, therefore you cannot attack me for this. I will need to investigate that more thoroughly at this point, because if the shoe's on one foot or the other, that changes the context entirely. However, that's the one that stuck with me, because the idea there was that she was firmly on the standpoint that they do not feel wrong for reporting this. There's not one and she's not alone. There's not one single journalist who I've seen who has come out since and admitted perhaps that was in poor taste. Perhaps following the journey of these players, touting how they're young, exuberant, full of hope, zero fear, they're being coached well, they like Southgate, he presents himself well, the training methods, they seem coherent, we've had a good prep to this World Cup, blah, 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 and are profiting off that and generating the goodwill that the fans all want, and the second they get a whiff of something that they think will generate immediate interest rather than a real feel-good story, which I'm not arguing for. I'm not saying all stories have to be good, but what I'm saying is that's the narrative you built going into this. To then turn around and say, oh, by the way, here's the team sheet. Other team sees that, they then have an opportunity to prepare in a certain way, which then cancels out any strategic advantage that they may have otherwise had going in. That means you're adversely affecting the topic you're covering, which is morally wrong. You should not be doing that. Your objective is to observe and report. Your objective is not to affect the outcome of a sporting event. And to correlate this, because again, I think sports journalists sometimes get a little bit ahead of themselves because of the word journalist being shared in the same vein as a news reporter or an actual journalist. And I say actual journalist for one reason. I don't think there's many footballing or sporting journalists that have ever risked their lives in pursuit of a story. Let's be honest here. And if I'm wrong, I'd love someone to correct me on this. However, drug correspondents, war correspondents, investigative journalists, when it comes to bribery and corruption, who could face the threat of death and have faced and have been killed in the pursuit of truth. Yes, of course, it's for juicy stories that will generate mass amounts of interest. However, football journalists get that anyway. They already have a news cycle of transfer news, results, upcoming events, names that they've built over the course of years. They have other ways of generating interest rather than just leaning on that one element. And I would invite people to just remember, when we start talking about sporting journalism in its rawest form, it's there simply to observe and speculate. That's it. To then start saying, oh, well, you know, we have the right to do this, right to do that. Yes, I agree with you to a certain degree, but when you start affecting the outcome, that's when you've lost sight. You're undermining your own points that you've made previously. You're selling a different narrative now without any provocation, without any real reason. And it's a microcosm of journalism as a whole. Selling to the lowest common denominator. So here's where I'm going to start. And ironically, where I'm going to end the podcast. People of the world. I'm not talking to the journalists, I'm not talking to members of the media or any other outlets or anything of that nature. I'm talking to the people, you, the consumer, the individual that sits there and chooses their news. You need to hold yourself to a higher account. If you see a news story that's clearly clickbait, if you see a news story that would appear on the face of it to have a morally ambiguous tone, or seems to be from a morally ambiguous perspective, then don't read it. Don't engage. Don't consume it. It's that simple. This news story caught me for one reason only. I wanted to see where the leak came from, because I was then going to form an opinion on it and comment as I did, prompting this podcast as a result of the interactions that I've had since, because I felt that that wasn't sufficient in order to convey how I felt. That's the only reason. Didn't read it for the actual information or the intrigue that they thought might pique my interest as a consumer. I'm not talking to the media when I say this initially, because it's irrelevant. The media will always pander to you, the consumer. If you set the standard, if you set the consumption, then the media has to follow. They have to follow. There's no use in me saying, media, hold yourselves to a higher standard. They've got businesses to run. They're there to make money. They're there to sell you stories. Telling them to stop and not report on something based on a moral value, moral equivalency, is stupid, because they will never listen. My interactions have proven that tenfold, because not one individual who I've seen tweet since. In fact, the icing on the cake, this is what prompted the podcast in the end, was an individual who retweeted or tweeted a quote from Gareth Southgate in a news press conference that said, "It's not the press's responsibility to aid or shield the team," or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing there. End of debate. That's obviously not Southgate. That was the guy who was tweeting and retweeted by various other sources. You've got to be fucking kidding me. You have to be kidding me. One person, admittedly from the perspective of the person, it's a bit like if there's a victim of a crime, that victim decides not to pursue personally the crime, doesn't want to press charges. Okay, I understand that logic to a degree. However, that's not the situation here. No one's on trial. It's a perception, it's a habit, it's a culture that England fans and football fans in general are pissed off with. They want a higher standard from their press. The problem is footballing fans by their nature are fickle, short memory spanned individuals who are very easily swayed by their media. Hence why I get a kick out of reading it, because more often than not, like I say, going back to the Sunday supplement a year after the fact is hilarious, because you see wildly different opinions on the exact same subjects and people. Wildly different. The difference between, for instance, Pep Guardiola from year 1 to year 2, massive. The difference between Mourinho starting at Man United and the hype behind that to now, where they're saying he could be the death of Manchester United, bollocks. They're there to sell you things. They're very talented at selling you, the consumer, things. It's your job as a consumer to be informed. It's your job as a consumer to heighten and elevate your level of consumption to make them match it. And on the off chance that anybody is listening to this podcast from a member of the media or the news or whatever the case may be, this would be my direct message to you. Of course, I understand you have a business to run. Of course, I understand that there's a rush to beat the opposition to the punch, to make that bit more money, to be able to tick over to the next day and pay the wages and pay the bills and keep the lights on, build the reputation. However, before anyone personally attacks me and says I'm doing the same thing, I would point you to the fact that none of my videos are monetized. My audience is very, very small. I tend to do stories and videos way after the relevance has passed. Way after I could ride any fucking wave of public interest or anything like that. I always try to take a considered opinion based on my moral stance and based on my integrity as an individual, with no bias or allegiance to anybody but myself. That's it. I would urge you to try and mirror those sentiments, because the public needs you to. Sometimes the public isn't smart enough for its own good. Sometimes the public makes dumb decisions they later regret. You're journalists, you're highly educated individuals with the power of the pen. It's incumbent upon you to be better. It's not even a question of choice. That's the point I'm trying to make in a long-winded way. You're better than this. You are more intelligent than your standard consumer. I can ask them, and that's all I can do. It's not their duty to change their consumption, but it is something that I would ask them to do. But it is your duty. You are supposed to be moral arbiters to a certain degree. You're there to sell stuff. I understand that. But that doesn't mean you have to compromise your integrity or your morals along the way. Or, here's the idea, just come out and admit you have none. Just admit, embrace the heel persona. That's what wrestlers do all the time. I'm the bad guy. Say hello to him. I'm here to sell you shit. I couldn't give a fuck about your opinions. Your opinions will change based on what I write, not the other way around. Public perception is something I will bend to the will of my narrative. Deal with it. If that's the perspective you have, fucking embrace it. Fucking own it. Stop hiding behind this pretense of, well, false equivalency and, well, what about this guy and blah, 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 blah. No, I'm holding you accountable. You specifically. Finger pointing now. Really angry for some reason. Wow. I like clouds. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in there because I seem to have gotten very, very aggressive and finger pointy all of a sudden. But a long-winded, roundabout way. Football fans, up your game. Journalists, get back to the pedestal we once placed you on. And everybody else, well, be like me. Enjoy them tearing shreds of shit out of each other. Best perspective I've seen is one of my personal heroes, Ian Wright, who said, yeah, it's perhaps naive of the guy to be walking around with a piece of paper, which is true, but it's also a pretty shit thing to do to zoom in on that piece of paper and report it to the world, when you didn't have to. There was no need to report on that, so why did you? Well, you saw an opportunity to make some money. Fucking embrace that persona if that's what you need to do. And to everybody else, I hope your consumption levels are already high. That's why you're listening to this podcast, because your consumption level is high. Because my audience, you sexy, brilliant, intelligent people, you know what's going on. This is the Veracious Show. We don't sugarcoat things here. We get straight to the point. So, from one conscientious consumer to hopefully others, I really hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. I hope you choose to engage as best you can with journalists in the future. Just don't, one favour to people that are pissed off, don't just go in there cussing a blue streak. I swore a couple of times in my tweets, but I tried to make it as constructive as I possibly could. Don't go in calling people cunts and fuckers and whatever. You just tone it down a little bit. Try to be constructive in your criticism and open a dialogue rather than just making accusations and finger point. Kind of like what I did at the end of this podcast. Beauty of being a podcaster that's not actually that's not trying to make any money. I can be slightly hypocritical if I need to be. Why not? Who gives a shit? I certainly do. I'm holding myself to a higher account now. I say, do you know what? Here's how I end the podcast actually. I apologise for the dichotomy of some of my statements. I stand by my moral argument. Journalists, you need to be better. Consumers, you need to hold yourselves to a higher standard. Period. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of The Veracious Show. My name's been Lorne Risley. I'm your host as always. Please stay tuned for future editions. Please like, share, subscribe. Please check out some of the other content creators in the description below. Check me out on Twitter. And as always, take care of yourselves. And I'll see you guys on the next episode.